This is what all of you believe. Well, okay, many of you have been listening to me, but before, if the first time you've heard me, this is what you've all been told, right? Just say yes, okay? Be obedient. This is all you've ever heard. This is what every story is. This is what they teach you at school. This is what is in the newspapers. Everybody believes this story for a very good reason. It's the only story out there. That's the only thing you can ever hear. But how do we know the above? Where does the material come from? Where does the information come from to support that timeline, to support those events? Well, you need to ask the Muslims, and they'll say it comes from the Islamic traditions. What do we mean by the Islamic traditions? Well, Muhammad dies in 632, and immediately the biography is put together. No, not immediately. It is not put together by anybody that knew Muhammad. Muslims say the first one to write down his biography is this guy, Ibn Ishaq. But do we have any reference? Do we have any codex from him? Is there anything written by him? Not at all. So we can't go to Ibn Ishaq. We have to go to this guy, Ibn Hisham. Ibn Hisham takes what students from Ibn Ishaq tell him to give, but he just throws away some and keeps whatever he wants. Basically, he just deletes and accretes as he goes by. So what we know about Muhammad comes from this guy here. Look at the date, 833. So the conclusion is, Muhammad was revealed 84 years after the Abbasids created him, 141 years after he was first introduced, yet 201 years after he supposedly lived. Ibrahim, therefore, Raymond Ibrahim, considers this 200-year gap as perfectly acceptable and thus not a problem.
Muslims often claim that Muhammad is more historically supported than Jesus. But is that really true? When we compare the sources, we find two very different pictures. On one hand, Jesus is backed by eyewitness testimony, with accounts written within decades of his life. On the other hand, everything we know about Muhammad was written down centuries later, far removed from the events themselves. In today's video, we'll be examining this claim head-on. Is Muhammad truly more historically supported than Jesus? Or does the evidence tell a very different story?
Well, what he has done, what I want to do is to take each one of those 10, including number 5 that's missing, and try to answer them, respond to them, and then see what Bob does with them in the panel afterwards. So here we go. Muhammad is so much more historically supported than Jesus, yet we accept Jesus' historicity, so isn't this hypocritical? His quote, "I find it amazing that whereas Christians rightfully cite Josephus and Pliny and Tacitus as early proof of Christ's existence, in other words, in the 1st and 2nd century, the non-Muslim references to Muhammad, which objectively speaking are even more compelling, since they were all written much closer to their subject's life, in other words, the 9th and 10th centuries, yet are dismissed as irrelevant by those who would make him a figment of our imagination." So therefore, what he's claiming is that Muhammad is far more historically supported than Jesus Christ. And by denying his historicity, we are not only being inconsistent, but possibly dishonest. So, is the historical support for Muhammad greater than that of Jesus Christ? Let's find out. Here's my response. To start with, let's go ahead and see what the Muslims claim so we know what we're responding to. And what the Muslims claim is this. They would claim that Muhammad's empire included that brown area. So just that area there, or, oh boy, I'm going to think, right that area there, very small area. You see what I'm saying? Just that, not very big. After he dies in 632, it then expands to the orange area. That's the Rashidun period. That's the period of Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, the 4 rightly guided caliphs, up until 661. Then after the Abbasids come to power in 749, 750, it then expands to the purple area, and it concludes all the way from Andalusia, which is Spain today, all the way to India in the east, from Turkey in the north down to Yemen in the south. Now, we're not really interested in the purple area. We're much more interested in the orange and the brown area. And that's the material that I'm going to show where the problems exist. According to their timeline, according to the standard Islamic narrative, what they tell us is that Muhammad was born in 570, that he started receiving the Quran in 610 in Mecca. So he was born in Mecca. It was not till he was 50 years old that he started, 40 years old that he started receiving the Quran. Boy, get my math right. 40 years he started receiving the Quran. In 621, he's woken up in the middle of the night, told to get on the back of the winged horse, and he flies up from Mecca up to Jerusalem, goes up to the seven heavens, and gets the 50 prayers. Hits the fifth heaven, finds out from Moses that's too many, so he bounces back and forth between the seventh and fifth heaven, and brings it down from 45 to 30 to 15 down to 5 prayers, comes back down to Jerusalem, gets on back the winged horse, and flies back down to Mecca. So that's 621. The next year, he then goes from Mecca to Medina with maybe 80 to 200 of his followers. It depends on which tradition you look at. And then in 630, he comes back to Mecca and walks in without firing a shot, takes over Mecca, and then he dies in 632. So that's the life of Muhammad right there, okay? From 570 to 632. Now, Abu Bakr comes immediately after. He only lasts about 2 years before he dies peacefully, fortunately. He is replaced by Umar, who lasts for 12 years. He is killed. But he expands the borders much more so than anybody else during his reign. When he is killed, Uthman takes over. He lasts only 12 years. And while he is on the throne as a caliph in Medina, he then compiles the Quran, and that's 652. He is then killed, and Ali takes over. He only lasts 5 years before he is killed by Muawiyah at the Battle of Siffin. So that is the timeline that they give us. I'm not going through the whole timeline. I'm just giving little bits and pieces just to get the skeleton, all right? What that means is that Islam was fully formed in the Hijaz by 661 according to the standard Islamic narrative. This is what all of you believe. Well, okay, many of you have been listening to me, but before, if the first time you've heard me, this is what you've all been told, right? Just say yes, okay? Be obedient. This is all you've ever heard. This is what every story is. This is what they teach you at school. This is what is in the newspapers. Everybody believes this story for a very good reason. It's the only story out there. That's the only thing you can ever hear. But how do we know the above? Where does the material come from? Where does the information come from to support that timeline, to support those events? Well, you need to ask the Muslims, and they'll say it comes from the Islamic traditions. What do we mean by the Islamic traditions? Well, Muhammad dies in 632, and immediately the biography is put together. No, not immediately. It is not put together by anybody that knew Muhammad. Muslims say the first one to write down his biography is this guy, Ibn Ishaq. But do we have any reference? Do we have any codex from him? Is there anything written by him? Not at all. So we can't go to Ibn Ishaq. We have to go to this guy, Ibn Hisham. Ibn Hisham takes what students from Ibn Ishaq tell him to give, but he just throws away some and keeps whatever he wants. Basically, he just deletes and accretes as he goes by. So what we know about Muhammad comes from this guy here. Look at the date, 833. We also have Al-Waqidi, who gives us the stories of the wars, the Maghazi documents. He dies in 835, both 9th century. Let's get rid of Ibn Ishaq since we don't need him anymore since we have nothing from him, okay? I get rid of him for a very good reason. If you have nothing for him, you get rid of him. Am I correct? Do you see the criteria I'm using? If there's nothing there, if there's nothing to look at, if you have no evidence, you go with the evidence on the ground. And we do have Ibn Ishaq. Sorry, Ibn Hisham. Boy, did I get that wrong. Now, that's not the only genre. You also have what we call the Hadith, the sayings of Muhammad, first introduced by this guy, Al-Bukhari, 870, then Al-Sahih Muslim, 875, Tirmidhi, 884. Look in the dates. Ibn Majah, 887, Ibn Dawud, 899, An-Nasai, 915. So those are the 6 major Hadith compilations. Notice they're all 9th and 10th century. And then we have 2 more genres, the Tafsir and the Tahriq, the commentaries, and the histories of mankind, first introduced by Al-Tabari. Well, folks, do you see a problem there? I'm showing it to you. There's 200-year gap. Are you satisfied with that? It's as if I were to say, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did not live in the 1st century. They all lived in the 3rd century, and they lived hundreds of miles away, and they redacted back to a man named Jesus. Would you trust it? No. Thank you. I got a good crowd here today. But we're gonna continue on. I want to just bring this guy, Abdul Malik, up because he is the first one to introduce the name, did I say Muhammad? No. He is the first one to introduce the name Muhammad. Hold that. That's going to come important in just a bit. And it's these people, the Abbasids, who actually introduce us to Muhammad himself. The Muhammad of Islam are really created by these individuals. But look when they come to power. 750. When did Muhammad die? 632. So the conclusion is Muhammad was revealed 84 years after the Abbasids created him, 141 years after he was first introduced, yet 201 years after he supposedly lived. Ibrahim, therefore, Raymond Ibrahim, considers this 200-year gap as perfectly acceptable and thus not a problem. To me, that's a problem, folks. That's a huge problem. But it's not just the dates. What about the places? What about where these men were living when they wrote it down? Now, according to what Muslims tell us, everything happens where those two green circles are, Mecca and Medina. That's the Hijaz. However, all of the writers were writing way up in Baghdad, which is 1,200 miles away. We know that Ibn Hisham, who writes the Sirah, he's the first one to do that. He was born in Basra, grew up in Cairo, wrote in Baghdad. That's 990, 1,200, and miles. I'm sorry I'm not using, you're miles here, so I can use miles. When we come to Al-Bukhari, he's way over in Uzbekistan. He lives in Bukhara, which is 2,600 miles away. Al-Tabari, who writes the first to write the Tafsir and the Tahriq, is in what is today northern Iran, in Tabaristan. That's 1,700 miles away. None of these men lived or worked in Mecca and Medina. They were way too far to the north and came from the west and east of Baghdad. I just went out. Oh, there we go. See, even my projector is flabbergasted. Now, folks, what about the historical record for Christianity? Do we not have the same problem? So we need to ask and we need to demand the same thing of both sides. So let's look at the historical record. And let's ask, see, basically because if you look at these four genres, the Sirah, the Hadith, the Tafsir, and the Tahriq, those are the same genre we have in the New Testament. The Sirah of Jesus, the biography of Jesus, would be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Right? That's who write down what he did. The Hadith of Jesus would be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John whenever he spoke. So in some of your Bibles, it's written in the letter red. Okay, so there's the Hadith of Jesus. The Tafsir of Jesus would be what Paul took and wrote for each church, the commentaries on what Jesus said in Philippi, in Ephesus, in Corinth. So that would be the Tafsir of Jesus. And then the Tahriq would be the history of the early church. Well, that was done by Luke in the book of Acts. So there's the same exact four genres that we have in the Islamic traditions. Like with like, okay? So let's look and ask, when were they written down? Here we go. So the first is the Tahriq, which would be the book of Acts. Now, I'm going to step on a lot of your toes. You're not going to agree with these dates. I'm taking the most liberal dates I can find. These are not ones that you really believe, so I'm going to step on your toes to make a point. So the Tahriq of the book of Acts, written between 52 and 62 AD by Luke. So that's within 20 to 30 years of Christ's death. You have Paul's letters were written between 48 and 65 AD when he was killed. That's within 50 to 34 years after Christ's death. The first Sirah and the first Hadith written by Mark is at 70 AD. That's 37 years after Christ's death. You get two more come from Matthew and Luke in 80 AD. That's 47 years. And then you have the final Sirah and the final Hadith. It's 57 years, which means between 29 and 50 years of Christ's death, we have the entire Sirah, Hadith, Tafsir, and Tahriq of Jesus. What's more, all of these writers lived in the same place Jesus lived. And they either knew him personally, like John and Matthew, or they got the material from others who did know them, like Mark and Luke. Therefore, they're much closer to the event and also at the same time. When you do a comparison between these two, notice that we have everything about what Jesus did, said, and how Christianity began within 60 years of Christ's death. Islam has nothing for 200 to 300 years. Which is the most authoritative? Coming and going, we have them on this. Well, I don't know what Raymond Ibrahim is reading. If we had to depend, and this is what I would say to Raymond Ibrahim, as a comparison, if we had to depend on sources for Jesus, compared to what Muslims are dependent on for Muhammad, Jesus would not begin to appear until the 3rd century. How would we defend him? With statistics like these, how can Ibrahim suggest that Muhammad is much more historically supported than Jesus? But which Muhammad is Ibrahim talking about? Which is the Muhammad he's referring to? The Muhammad of Islam, he's referring to, require 4 things. To be the Muhammad of Islam, he must have used the name Muhammad, that word right there. There it is, Mimha, Mimdal, with a Dama, Fatah, and a Fatah. You have to use that word to get Muhammad, right? So it has to be that name that we're looking for. Secondly, he must live in the city of Mecca. There it is. You must have a place called Mecca for him to live, because he was there from 570 to 622. For 52 years he lived there. Thirdly, he had to have received, that Muhammad had to receive the Quran, all 114 surahs, by the time he died. And then number 4, he had to exist in the 7th century. So you have to have basically all 4 of the above criteria, the man, the place, the book, and the time, must be fulfilled in order to prove that the Muhammad of Islam actually existed. Who can do that right now? Ooh, this makes my job so easy. Okay? Let's go ahead. So let's start with the name. Ibrahim suggests that we can find the name Muhammad in a written text. Muhammad's everywhere, he's saying. It's much more, factly, much more so than the name of Jesus. But in order to have that word Muhammad, you need 4 consonants. Mim, ha, mim, dal. Or this way, mim, ha, mim, dal, going your direction. And you have to have 3 vowels. Dama, fatha, and a fatha, all right? To do so. In the 7th century in Arabic, there were no vowels. There were only consonantal letters, 16 of them. The vowels were only created in the 8th and late 9th century. In fact, were only canonized until the 9th century. So you can't have Muhammad. Take a look at the text. Look at the Ma'il. There's the Samarkand. I'm putting up the Petropolitanus. Well, I thought I was. The Sana and the Topkapi manuscript. Do you see any vowels on any of them? Those are 5 of the 6 earliest manuscripts. Do you see any 28 letters in them? Today you have 28 letters, and that's how you can get Muhammad, with 28 letters. But back in the 7th century, there were only 16 letters, and there was only a mimha mimdal. Mimha mimdal. Let's show you exactly what I'm talking about. So, today, this is what Muhammad looks like. That's what he looks like today. Without the vowels, however, you need to take the vowels out, and what do you have? That's what you have. Mimha mimdal, no vowels. How then would you pronounce that word? Go ahead, try it. How do you get the oo? Where'd you get that from? You're just making it up, aren't you? Shouldn't we go back to the 7th and 8th century and find out how it was pronounced? Would you like to do that? So we should be looking for Muhammad, not Muhammad. We should be going to the 7th century and seeing how they used it, how they pronounced it, what they did use. So how is it pronounced? Why don't we go to John of Damascus? John of Damascus is writing about Muhammad. He is writing it in his greatest tome in 730. He was there under Abd al-Malik. He was the treasurer in the courts of Abd al-Malik from 685 up to 705. He then left Abd al-Malik's court, and then he went down to Jerusalem. He went into retirement. And there at a monastery, he wrote his greatest masterpiece. Look at the word, look at the title of the masterpiece. The Heresy of the Ishmaelites. Heresy means what? It's against another religion. So it has to be a heresy against Christianity. And who? The Ishmaelites. Why doesn't he call them Muslims? He's writing this in 730. This is a whole 100 years after Muhammad. And what does he talk about? The Muhammad. Look how he writes it in Greek. In Greek, there are vowels. Look at the vowels right there, folks. Can you see the vowels? Muhammad. It's so simple. Just read the Greek. And from that time until now, a false prophet called Muhammad sprang up among them, who after conversing with an Arian monk concerning the Old and New Testament, fabricated his own heresy. So he is a heretic, a heresy of an Arian heresy. Are you following that? Just read the text. Let's continue on. So what does Muhammad mean in Arabic? Well, this is why I had to redo my entire PowerPoint, because our good friend Mel did everything for me this morning. How many were here this morning? Shame on the rest of you for not, because he did a slap-up job going through inscription after inscription after inscription, 7 to 8 inscriptions showing this word. It's all over the place in that part of the world. It means the praised one. It means the blessed one. It means the anointed one. It's not a name. It's a title. Muhammad has always been a title. It even means the Messiah later on. It was first used in Ugaritic in the 1400 BC. And then it was used in Hebrew in 1000 BC. In fact, it's found 11 times in our Old Testament. Muhammad is found all over. Mahmadim is found all over in the Old Testament. Song of Solomon 5:16. Mahmadin, altogether lovely, referring to Solomon. It was subsequently employed by St. Ambrose in the 4th century AD as a title for Jesus Christ, the Messiah. From the 4th century, other church fathers employed Muhammad to refer to Jesus Christ himself. Look at these examples. Origen in the 3rd century, St. Ambrose in the 4th century. Origen said that it interpreted the Song of Solomon's 5:16 passage as the unique scripture where the eschatological nuptials of Christ and his bride are present. St. Ambrose then in the 4th century introduced the idea that the Song of Solomon 5:16 passage referred to Muhammad was to be considered a title for Jesus Christ. Gregory of Elvira in the late 4th century, St. John Cassian in the 5th century, St. Augustine in the 5th century, all then referred to Muhammad as the Messiah, as Jesus Christ. Therefore, in the 7th century, this was picked up by Apollonius himself. So, the Muhammad was common title for Jesus by the 7th century in the church in that part of the world. So we should not be surprised when we find it written in many places at that time. But the Jews also considered the Muhammad as the anointed one, not just the Christians. Notice the 523 inscription that Mel referred to this morning. The 6th century Jewish rock inscription. Found in Yemen, what is today Yemen. It is part of the Jewish Himyaritic inscription dated to 523. And the translation is Rab Had Mahmad. But take a look and see the word. There it is. I'm going to make it out for you. Can you see the Mim Ha Mim Dal? This is Sabbaic Arabic, but it's still Arabic. It's just written with a different script. Interestingly, this would be the script that the Quran should have been written in. Does that look like the Quranic script? Ooh, that is not the Quranic script. Oh, I love this. That is Sabbaic script. Yet it's still Arabic, and yet it's way down in Yemen. So, Muhammad means praised one, blessed one, anointed one, even Messiah. It was always a title introduced by the Ugarites, borrowed by the Hebrews. It's right through our Old Testament, subsequently employed by St. Ambrose as a title for Jesus. The Jews also took it from the 6th century on, referring in. There are 7 to 8 inscriptions that Mel introduced this morning, showing it over and over and over again. Muhammad is both there for the Jews and the Christians. By the 7th century, the Christians used Muhammad to refer to the returning Messiah, who is going to come a second time, while the Jews used Muhammad to refer to the Messiah yet to come, and at times interchanging it with Messiah. Conclusion? Therefore, the term Muhammad was well known in that part of the world and at that time, but it was not pronounced as Muhammad. That is how we pronounce it today, and that has been our problem. Even Mel made that mistake this morning. How many times did you say Muhammad? I almost jumped up and said, would you shut up and stop calling him Muhammad? It's always been Muhammad. Read it as it should. And that is why there's so much confusion, and including why Ibrahim is so confused. Knowing that, let's now look to see exactly when his story was created within Islam itself. Now here it is.
When Muslims argue that Muhammad has stronger historical support than Jesus, they often point to later Islamic writings as proof. But here's the problem. The earliest Islamic sources don't appear until the 9th century, about 200 to 300 years after Muhammad supposedly lived. The earliest biography of Muhammad, attributed to Ibn Ishaq, doesn't survive. Instead, we rely on later edited versions. The Hadith collections, which Muslims trust for details about Muhammad's words and deeds, were also compiled centuries later. That's not eyewitness testimony, that's legend building. By contrast, when we look at Jesus, we find a very different situation. The Gospels were written within one generation of his life, between 30 and 60 years after the crucifixion. Many of the New Testament writers were eyewitnesses themselves or got their material from direct eyewitness accounts. Early church fathers quoted these writings extensively, confirming that they circulated widely in the 1st century. Even non-Christian sources like Tacitus, Josephus, and Pliny the Younger mention Jesus. So when we ask the question, who has the evidence? The answer is clear. Christianity stands on a solid historical foundation, grounded in eyewitness testimony. Islam, by contrast, depends on traditions written centuries later, with no contemporary witnesses. The evidence points to Jesus, not Muhammad.